So all the panelists are here. Okay, so I would like to start our annual meeting panel discussion for Asper Cascade chapter. It is a very small group, but I am so glad that people are able to come here. And particularly, I'm grateful that the two panelists are willing to take the time and present your thoughts about, particularly in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So briefly about the ASPA Cascade chapter. ASPA, American Society for Public Administration, is a national organization for mainly people in the public administration, public service profession. We all have a regional chapter, and this is the member of the Cascade chapter that covers Oregon and the Southwest Washington. This last year, the Asper Cascade chapter board members initiated a strategic planning and came to the kind of agreement that we would like to focus on social justice as one of our focus areas. And so as our first annual meeting event, we thought it would be useful for our members to hear from people who are actively engaged in the DEI effort in various different kind of organizations. And I just was able to kind of connect with Steve Lee from State of Oregon, Jinian from and then Lorena Tillman from the Washington County. And I would let you all introduce yourself, and then after you have the self-introduction, I will kind of start off with some questions, and you can respond to our questions as we go along. Okay, so Steve, do you want to go first?
Good evening. I'm Steve Lee, and I'm the Affirmative Action Manager in the Governor's Office. The primary responsibility I have is directing and monitoring state agency fulfillment of their affirmative action and equal opportunity requirements. I'm an Oregonian who started my career in the legislature a long time ago. And knowing that being from Oregon and how challenging it was to be in a state where the Black population is so small, and kind of being in organizations where it was so difficult to navigate, being the only one in so many instances. I left and began work in organization. I went out east. I was in Washington, D.C. and New York for a number of years, and began to work in organizations that were Black-led, and kind of the focus was different. And I learned a lot about, mostly I worked on, I'm an urban planner by training, and I worked on a lot of equitable engagement projects, and understood kind of the value of kind of real inclusive decision-making, and kind of how that tended to get us to sustainable solutions and things that lasted in communities because they gave a little bit more value to people's lived experiences. And then I, eventually kind of went to Seattle and worked for the mayor in Seattle, who Seattle has a very rich history of racial and social justice. They were one of the first jurisdictions to create a race and social justice initiative. And basically it's a program that creates a screen for equity assessments for policy decisions. And when I left the city there, I came down here to be the affirmative action manager. And it's been kind of an interesting kind of growth in our office. But I'm here in Oregon. It's kind of interesting that I've kind of come full circle and back to Oregon to try to see if we can advance an equity agenda at the state level, which has its challenges that I'll talk about. But, I'm involved in racial equity just because I live in a state now where it's such an important thing to take on.
Well, thank you, Steve. And Steve and I had a full conversation on the potential DEI-related project, and I think we have to meet next week to further develop the conversation. So I'm looking forward to that. All right, so the next, I would like to invite Junior from Tualatin Private School District for the self-introduction and the background.
Sure, thank you. Hi, my name is Zinnia Un. I'm the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Tiger Tualatin School District. And I am so impressed just by hearing from Steve, and and I am, my background is in special education, literacy, instruction as well. So I bring that background, and I've worked in early childhood over the last 2 decades. So very steeped in the field of education. I grew up in Long Beach, California, and grew up there in the 90s, and so I have that perspective. I moved here in 2003, and it was a bit of a culture shock, to be quite honest, to come to Oregon, and so that really painted my perspective as like a practitioner in education. And what I found was, there was a lot of, I think, fear in engaging in equity work in the schools. I feel like there's a disconnect between the desire to serve students and educate them, and the gap between understanding what it means to be culturally relevant, culturally sustaining, and how to practice culturally responsive teaching. And so I brought that lens in the realm of special education, as well as literacy instruction. And then our equity work at TTSD has come from a lot of grassroots. It's anchored in cultural, I think, sustainability, and also just being able to engage in critical discourse that helps broaden people's perspective to understand multiple perspectives, and the need to include stakeholders in decision making that actually anchors in the community, as opposed to centers the dominant power structures. So those are the things. I'm also a doctoral student, and a lot of the work that I am focused on is around equity in complex systems and collectivism. So I'm happy to be here and excited for the conversation.
Thank you, Junior. I learned about Junior through my student last term. I was teaching cross-cultural communication class, and one of my students introduced Junior, and I got to read the paper, and I thought I really want to meet Junior. And so when this kind of discussion opportunity came up, I was like, can I invite Junior so I can meet with her? So thank you for having. All right, last but not least is Lorena Tillman from Washington County. I got introduced by another friend of mine, Janelle Bell, and he kindly connected us with you. Thank you. So Lorena, would you like to do your introduction and a brief background?
Sure. Thank you so much, Masami, and good evening, everyone. It's nice to see everyone here, especially Steve Lee, who I left, I don't know when, 7 months ago, something like that. When I left the state of Oregon to go to Washington County, Steve was my buddy. So my name again, Lorena Tillman. I'm the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at Washington County. I've been in that role since mid-September. And my the opportunity there for me is as the inaugural Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, which after doing some reflection and thinking back is actually the 5th opportunity that I've had to stand up an Office of Equity and Inclusion. I did that at Oregon Housing and Community Services immediately prior to coming to Washington County. And then also had the opportunity to do that at Oregon Health Authority when it was born as an agency, the Department of Human Services prior to that, and then at Multnomah County with the Health Equity Initiative. But I really come to this work more on accident. I was trained in public health, which I also kind of fell into accidentally by working at a community health center in Tucson, pretty much right after college, El Rio Santa Cruz Neighborhood Health Center. And so I come to this work by way of an opportunity to work in culturally specific healthcare settings, as well as work on human services work focused on overrepresentation of kids of color in the foster care system. And so I have kind of that health and human services background. And then with a focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion always. And when I went to the state of Oregon for the first time to work at DHS, that's when I really became more immersed in civil rights law. And I'm not a lawyer, but have really focused on helping the state fully implement civil rights law, especially as it relates to culturally and linguistically appropriate service delivery. So I'm happy to be here. You might hear a little background noise. It's after 5 in my house, and who knows what you might hear in the background.
Thank you. And I also have to warn everybody because my puppy is sleeping right now, but if my neighbor starts doing any kind of a yard work, he will start howling. So my apologies if that happens. So the first question we prepared was to ask each of you how you are approaching the DEI work at your organization, maybe currently, and also, if you have any other examples that you want to draw on from your past engagement with other organizations. But what is your approach? What is the kind of guiding principles that you apply? Should I mix up the order and go with different person? Maybe I'll start with Zinnia then.
Of course, yes, sure. With the name Zinnia, typically in the roster, I'm always last, and whether it's Zinnia or Un, so it works. I think I approach this work through personal lived experiences and also the connections that I've made with students and families over the span of the last 2 decades in education. I actually am a daughter of refugees from Cambodia during the genocide. So that is a major part of my, I think, history and the impact of education. And so for me, I also grew up in, like I said, Long Beach, California, in a system that made decisions for a lot of the community members, where at that time, there were a lot of magnet schools. So I was taken out of my home community and was basically was bused for 12 years of my life, which really impacted, I think, my personal journey around identity development and the aspect of kind of slowly finding myself, disconnected from my community because of that. And I, of course, had to learn all those things together. And that made an imprint for me, especially aligned to this conversation around public administration and the necessary steps to ensure that you are engaging with your stakeholders with whatever decision making that you have. So I am a big believer of understanding social political context, but also understanding your local context. So the importance of using that understanding, but also vetting it through your community members to ensure that whatever decisions you make are responsive to those specific in your community. And so big believer in collectivism and the need to also acknowledge that identity is a part of keeping ourselves whole in whatever decisions that we make. So that is another part of the work that I have, and as an educator, the importance of culturally and community responsiveness in the classroom, as well as the importance of building the skills of students to be critical thinkers, especially in this time. So that's the approach that I have. And the other thing about that is, just helping build people's capacity to convene community in discussion and power sharing. And so that's kind of, I think, my first step approach to that.
Thank you. That's really deep and at the same time kind of broad, and tells us a lot about your approach. How about that, Lisa?
Yeah, so I think I shared a little bit about how I come to the work just in my introduction, because as I mentioned, I started really with the work while working at a culturally specific community health center. Mm-hmm. And so my orientation, I think, was really informed by not having whiteness as the center, or having real-time translation of messages, like health messages around things like, at the time that I started in healthcare, it was like the early days of the HIV epidemic, and just prior to the tobacco settlement. So after 30 years of struggle to get tobacco recognized as harmful for your health, and then the lawsuits and stuff that started coming out, and then there was the whole master settlement. But being sort of in a community that was very diverse, I was in Tucson at the time, and working from a culturally specific healthcare frame, the orientation is that dominant culture messages don't apply necessarily to the lived experience of diverse communities. And so knowing, similar to Zinnia, that being in relationship with diverse communities is essential to understanding what the real threats are to community and how those play out in communities, but also really being oriented to the strengths and resilience within those communities, the cultural norms within those communities that promote health and well-being and togetherness as protective factors to minimize risk as part of the orientation for me. So really thinking about cultural strengths, that cultural preservation similarly. Interestingly enough, I think even though we didn't have GIS mapping or like robust data analytics in terms of health care, like kind of rapid access to healthcare analytics, the community health center that I was at, they kind of drew their own maps, and we did these sort of like overlays, like if you remember the overhead projectors, like really being able to focus in on like where are the communities and what's the need, and being able to understand, who's getting diagnosed with what in our community, which we could access through the healthcare delivery system. So really valuing data, valuing culturally specific data analytics, And then, as I mentioned, well, I guess the other piece would be like language access. Like I kind of work myself out of a job at El Rio because I am not bilingual in Spanish, and like seeing the amazing cultural diversity from the front desk to the medical director and the finance director and the executive director. It's like, you know, seeing what was possible, but not being able to keep up myself, you know, but still the lesson for me was around culturally and linguistically appropriate service delivery, that it's possible. Um, um, so I think those things were really fundamental for me. And then, as I mentioned, going to the state of Oregon and realizing that at no point in my training as a public health professional in a community-based organization in healthcare delivery or in 9 years in local government had I ever learned about civil rights laws. And so to me, like having that legal foundation that basically says it's not about your opinion or whether you want to do this or not, it is law. And for me, I think emotionally, personally, feeling like this work connects me to the work, the very courageous work of the civil rights movement is so powerful, that the work that we're doing, implementing that as sort of a launch pad, connects me directly to Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and Ella Baker and all these other people. And, you know, in terms of the struggle and what they were able to leave as like a toolkit and a roadmap for where we go from here.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment saying I'm also the chair of the Department of Public Administration at PSU. And we have diversity requirements, and one of the courses we offer under diversity requirement is a civil rights law. So we are fortunate to have Dr. Hooper, who has the expertise on civil rights. And I'm so glad that you kind of highlighted the importance of the people in the public sector to have an understanding of civil rights. So I will emphasize that to my students, saying that I heard from you.
Yeah. Well, and I just add really quickly that a lot of the public discourse that we now have around equity and racial justice, it's the same conversation that they were having in the 60s. It's just the language has been like, you know, polished a little bit and sort of updated, but it's the same issues. So yeah, we're working on the same set of fundamentals.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you. How about you, Steve? Your approach.
So I'm going to talk about it. Kind of my view of the world is kind of around systems. And so it's taken me about 2 years to kind of figure out, something I've been with the state, kind of how is the state organized, you know, and kind of where are the best places to get in and affect some change. I'll tell you a little bit of story. So before Oregon was a state, there was a transportation commission, a fish and wildlife commission, and a forestry commission. Those existed before there was an incorporation of a state, okay? So they are what I call the spine of our state government. I don't think it's accidental that when you do the demographics around agencies, that those 3 agencies are 1, 2, 3 at the bottom in terms of diversity and the number of women in their organization leadership. Without fail, they are always kind of land in the bottom. And I think that until you can kind of crack that part of the system, it's really, really difficult to, you know, affect wholesale change. And so that's part of what I'm up against. The other piece that I realize is that the state has 41,000 employees, right? And so you got to kind of figure out, okay, where in there are the allies? And a lot of people kind of say, well, let's take on the toughest organizations first. Let's take on the Fish and Wildlife, the Forest Service, the Department of Transportation folks. And I say, no, that's not where I wanted to start. And so what I've been looking for and building is this small group of allies, right? So I have a slide that I can put up, Masami. If you let me share your screen, I can put it up and kind of talk a little bit about how I've been organizing my thinking. But And what's been exciting about the work is when I got to Oregon and started working at the state, people, I'm going to say confused, but people didn't really understand how I would distinguish diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? They thought that everything that I was talking about was about changing the representation of people in our workforce, not recognizing the fact that if the system is broken, putting more people in a broken system is not solving, but is exacerbating the problem. For example, there was a big push on hiring women and women of color. So when I looked at the statistics, what I saw was, yes, we have a growing number of women Latinas in the workforce. However, they are clustered in the lowest paying jobs. And so if you just hire them for the same jobs, you're really perpetuating the problem. And so the state really has had a difficult time looking in an honest way at the system of human resources. And so that's kind of one of the things I've discovered. And then the problem with systems is that people get invested in them. And so it's really difficult for people to kind of be reflective and look at, I've actually built this system. And so part of what, I struggle with is kind of breaking through the denial that people don't understand the role that government has played in, kind of building racist systems, right? And what systemic racism has to do with government. They kind of go, well, we provide services and we do this and we do that. And the acknowledgement of the role of government is a disconnect, and it's really difficult to advance racial equity if there's no acknowledgement that there is a racial problem, right? The other piece of that is people are just not comfortable talking about race. And so when I went into a room around our budget, the way that it was organized was around diversity. And what that meant was, it meant communities of color, kind of, but it was really about rural Oregon, which are not people of color, right? And so that was kind of the way that diversity was defined. And so really a milestone for me was after George Floyd's murder, I actually got people to begin to talk about racial equity, right? It took that long for people to actually say race, right? And kind of on this equity issue to talk about what we need to do is take on racial equity. And, the governor, to her credit, kind of pulled us all together and said, I have 2 years left and I'm going to devote the rest of my term to advancing ways to dismantle systemic racism. The problem with my job and with her job is that they're temporary jobs. And so all of the thinking, all the good stuff that I do, if it's not institutionalized, it's not sustained, right? And so part of the challenge that I'm kind of facing is, okay, what is it that I can leave behind so that, there's some forward and some momentum to get things moving and keep things moving in terms of advancing racial equity. I often kind of say I have this, it's kind of like trying to calibrate momentum. So kind of when the governor kind of said she wants to, pivot and kind of devote resources to racial equity, she convened a council, right? And kind of asked them, how should I kind of prioritize state budgets and spending? And this group of stakeholders came up with $280 million worth of investments, right? And so the budget went down with that much of an investment in ways to dismantle systemic racism, criminal justice, environment, human services, housing, lots of ways that we did that. And so my thing is that, so once we get the money and we direct agencies to do it, is the capacity on the ground to actually meet expectations and make it happen, right? Again, you've got 41,000 people, many of which don't even acknowledge that government has a role in ending systemic racism. And so that's really the challenge. And so, I think the good news is that people are slowly beginning to normalize and being able to talk about race and talk about racial equity. The other thing is that there's leadership in the government in a way that hasn't been around in a long time. We're beginning to build infrastructure. And so at the beginning of the budget cycle, we were getting all agencies to identify in their budget positions of people that would be in positions to do just DEI work. Excuse me a second. As the budget process kind of moved forward, we didn't have enough resources to have everyone do it. But several agencies already had done that. And over time, say since Trisha's been gone, I mean, Trisha was in an agency that had a designated person there. And you know, since she's been gone, 7 or 8 other agencies have kind of identified people. So slowly we're building the infrastructure and the focus, right? And so that's what's great. And so that's some of the strategies that we're using to kind of embed this is to nurture leadership, create requirements, kind of legal requirements to do the work, dedicate budget work to do it, right? Budgets to do the work, to support it. And that's the way that we'll sustain some of it, is if you put the resources behind it, put the policies in place and the infrastructure in place. And then you have to work at bringing people along. And I have a slide I'll share a little bit later if we have time about how to organize your thinking around that and what that looks like. So that's kind of my kind of approach. It's around systems, and that's really how I've been thinking about it.
Interesting, great. I think at this point, I just want to just ask if any of you have any comments to react to, or from the audience, any questions. We have some more questions prepared, but I think we were itching to ask. So Jennifer?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I think your introductions, just your approaches to diversity, and just this one question is already blowing my mind. So thank you. But I did have a question for Steve. You talked a little bit about the Racial Equity Council, and you mentioned this need to be institutionalized change. Do you think the Racial Equity Council is reaching that piece about being institutionalized change?
We hope it will. So when the governor convened them and we selected these 40 some odd people, plus a couple of subcommittees, they were an ad hoc group that was an advisory to the governor around the budget. She has sent forth legislation to make it a permanent entity in the government, So we're trying to make it permanent, give it a specific role, and connect it to the governor's office so that they can really influence in a meaningful way decision-making. Because we have lots of advisory groups, but if you really can't sit at the table and actually say, here are our priorities, and then see them realized, there's no point in having them. But we are making an effort to really kind of by law create this Racial Justice Council.
Anybody else? Diane?
Well, I have a bunch of questions. Thank you so much to all of you for coming here. This is, for me as a grad student, this is always my lifeblood to hear from people who are on the ground doing the work right now. I have a question for Steve, but also Latricia. And I guess it's both kind of around the same thing. How do you create that kind of buy-in? So when it comes to civil rights laws, do you just say we're out of compliance, we need to do this? How do you create that buy-in? And Steve, with you, when it comes to getting people to, carve out capacity, because having those resources are integral to the success and sustainability, how do you approach getting people to agree? So I guess my main question to all three of you is, how are you getting buy-in for these endeavors to ensure that they are sustainable?
Tricia, you want to take off with the civil rights and the legal piece, and I can follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. And I would just say that it's really not a linear process. I will just add to your earlier comment, Steve, that because the governor established the, Racial Justice Council on Racial Justice, that's how I'm structuring my community facing equity board for Washington County. So we learn from each other and play off each other. Somebody stretches, it gives room and permission for somebody else to also stretch along with that. So I just want you to know that, that work has ripple effects in other jurisdictions. We pay attention to what each other's doing. As it relates to building buy-in for civil rights law, my experience really started when I was at the Department of Human Services. And when I started there, Peggy Ross, who at the time was the governor's affirmative action officer, she sort of gave me the charge and just said, I can share with you the number of cases that are coming from the Department of Human Services going directly to BOLI. The staff there don't trust the process for what's happening with discrimination and harassment. And so, you know, with that little piece of information, I was able to just start asking questions around like, well, what are we doing related to discrimination and harassment? And this was focused on employees primarily. And HR at the time couldn't really tell me what they were doing because they kind of handled the work in a case-by-case basis. And so I just asked, I kind of relied more on the data frame for that. Like, okay, well, how many discrimination harassment cases are you investigating? And how are they being resolved? And how long does it take you to, you know, go through an investigation process? And are you seeing any patterns and what's happening as a result? And the more, there was no answer, there was no system. The way that I built buy-in in a health and human services world was by saying, you know, we need to approach this from a public health framework. Like what you're doing in HR is hospital care. People drive into the ER, you know, stuff is falling apart, crisis mode. And we have no idea how to prevent this because we're dealing with stuff on a case-by-case basis. It's hugely resource intensive. If it's going to BOLI, it's using legal resource. If we're settling, it's using financial resource. And so, and there was a culture there at the time that really was like a blame the messenger culture. So people didn't see, it's very, very much aligns with what Steve was saying. Like people didn't see, were not aware of how government systems create inequities, and people who aren't reflecting on that just perpetuate it. And so at the time, like if you were raising questions around like, well, how are employees with disabilities treated or whatever, the person who raised the question became the problem, not the issue of discrimination or harassment. So anyway, that kind of the fact that there wasn't a system in place really created the buy-in, because what we were doing was at that time healthcare reform. So it was the whole systems reform era. So as soon as so I think we just got a little grace and we were able to develop a system where we were able to pull discrimination harassment complaints out of HR, which is pretty much unheard of, and into our office. And the first complaint that we received was a woman who was being sexually harassed on her job by a contractor. And it was so clear cut. It was like, it was appalling the way that she was being treated by this contractor who was nationally known. Right. But and her documentation was stellar. And, you know, there was just so much, it was like such a glaring example that people were like, oh, this is really happening. And I think for me, part of the buy-in is saying, we talk in really proactive language, right? Equity, diversity, inclusion, it's all aspirational. What we forget is that there's a reason why we have to use those words. It's because there is discrimination, there is harassment, there is inequity. And people really didn't think about what I called the dirty underbelly, you know, of the organization, because it had always just been swept under the rug. And so the more that we shared examples of that dirty underbelly, right, the stuff that had been sort of hidden, the more momentum there was, because no one would say, you know, we need to do less, or we don't need to worry about that. I mean, the examples that we were seeing were so glaring that it kept reinforcing. So I'll just share, like when I started pulling discrimination harassment complaints out of HR, we had one investigator, and within 6 months she had 50 cases that she was responsible for investigating, which led to 2 and 3 investigators. And then we started asking questions about client civil rights. And so that led to additional investigators. And at the time, OHA sort of split out from DHS, and then DHS had to build their own investigative arm as well. So it just like the evidence reinforced the need for building more capacity.
So just kind of build on that. So I don't know, Tricia, when you did that, it sounds like it was maybe 10 years ago or somewhere around when you were doing stuff with OHA.
2009 to 14, 15, yeah.
So fast forward to now, and it's only in the last year that, and so part of it is that so how do you get people to comply? Well, some of it you got to shame them into it, or you got to like call it out so that it's hard to ignore, right? And so showing people data, kind of what it looks like, it's really hard to kind of ignore it. You can decide not to do anything with it, but at least you have the information. So people oftentimes don't want to do good, but they don't want to say they don't want to do good. If you ask somebody, you know, do you really realize what's going on in your agency? They're like going, we're doing a great job, you know. So part of it is you have to call out the issue, right? And so it's only now, kind of what Tricia said, that I'm now kind of taking, because we had a conversation about this a year ago. So I'm now asking for, in the affirmative action plans, for agencies to now report to the governor what kind of cases do you get, how long does it take to investigate them, are there patterns, are there recurrences, you know, where do they happen, how much do they cost? So we're collecting the information so then there can be some accountability, because part of it is that there's no accountability. There's none, you know, no one's really kind of keeping a watch on people and, you know, saying, what do you do? And I think that's generally the problem is that, you know, first of all, you've got, and so what happened last year was the Secretary of State in that audit function did an audit of the system and said, you got all these problems. And of course, the agency looks at it and kind of goes, we agree. And I say, well, if you agree, let's do something about it. So part of it's calling out the issue. Part of it's some visibility of the issue. And you can't have people ignore it, right? The other thing that I try to do, and this is kind of the subversive side of my work, is try to, wherever I can, to shed light on an issue and then bring community in to keep an eye on it, because it creates accountability systems, right? If you got people watching you, then you're more likely to kind of behave well because you've got an eye on you. If we just do things and it stays within the government, I think sometimes things get lost. And so part of it is when you want people to do things is to create some accountability around it. I, you know, working in Seattle when we were trying to get agencies to do more racial equity work around policies and programs, you know, basically I kind of got them to put it in their performance agreement. So when they sat down with the mayor, you know, and the mayor could say, how many of these actually have you done? You know, there was a standard. And so the state, there are no performance agreements right now. And so there is no accountability there. So how do you then kind of create that in your organization? You know, you get your mayor, your county, whoever your boss is, if they're elected, how do you get them to hold their leadership accountable? Because you need the leadership there, right? So it's the accountability, it's the visibility, it's kind of the buy-in, or I call it the shaming in to do it. So people want to do good, but they don't always don't know how to do it. So, did that answer your question?
Yes, this was great. And thank you so much for bringing up auditing. I actually just joined the Multnomah County Auditors Advisory Committee, and I was like, I don't even really know what auditing does. And so knowing that you can use it to really advance equity is really great for me to know and read up on, so I can try to make some recommendations. You know, I always believe when it comes to this work, we all have to do our part and see where we have ends to kind of affect some change. So this was very great. Thank you so much.
Well, the thing about audits is by nature, they're quantitative, right? It's not that you just go in and you kind of see what people are doing. You see how much of it or how less of it they're doing, right? And so audits are a way to actually quantify, you know, and kind of, you know, make material what someone is or is not doing. So they're really, really great tools to call out an issue, because it's hard to kind of look away when you show them, here is the data, right? And so auditing is a great way to kind of make people accountable by data.
I'll just add too that I'm sharing the state of Oregon's audit report internally in Washington County to help support the building of a system. I'm just, I don't think we can reinforce enough like how important it is to have this sort of cycle of learn, reflect, try, share, learn, the whole sort of cycle of process and learning from our colleagues.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask Julia if you have any thoughts on getting a buy-in.
I think my perspective might be a little bit different from the school. I'm working in the pre-K 12 system. So a lot of the work that I'm focused on is not, of course it's responsive, but a lot of it is hoping to be preventative as well, because as you know, our schools are the ones that are either reinforcing structures of oppression or working to disrupt and shift it. So I didn't get to share this. The approach that I take is one that is, I didn't know it at the time, but it really is focused on recognizing the gap between, I think, people's quote unquote either statement towards equity and their behaviors that either are aligned to it or not. And so sometimes being able to offer space for people to kind of grapple with that is where I feel those authentic personal, professional development for capacity to do, I think, right, or to do things that would close that gap between intention for equity and the actual outcomes. So I typically don't like to use the words buy-in because it's like I'm selling something, right? As opposed to what would that look like if this conversation around equity not only just benefits those that are pushed to the margins, but also heals you as a human being. Because guess what? Folks who are white are also stripped from their humanity by not seeing the humanity in other people. So when I talk about restorative practices and I talk about trauma-informed practices, those are the things that I think about when we serve and support our families and our students. And I say that because what I found is that especially in, and I worked with students with social emotional behavioral needs as well, understanding that there was a lot of disproportionality in that as well. So I worked with a lot of students and staff to kind of calibrate and understand how the system either perpetuates or highlights that. My work around this is, so people don't know, I categorize people's behaviors in many different forms. So there is this part of unconscious bias, but Joyce King talks about disconsciousness. So we can't also put it in this concept of dichotomous, either you are a racist or you aren't. I think all of us have racist tendencies that we have to account for and kind of grapple with ourselves. And I say that because, what I found is just as we would want and expect people to have the skills to interrupt and do different, we don't typically have time. We don't typically stop and help people understand how to do the different. So are we able to offer micro shifts in perspective? So the way that so talking about systems, I look at relationships as a driver for a lot of this stuff. And as, again, I'm speaking really from the preventative components in education. So, being able to hold space for people's first thoughts and recognizing that those first thoughts, and these are some of the protocols that I use in supporting discourse and broadening perspectives. It's that idea that, we move so fast and the processes of conditioning our beliefs through media, through lived experience, through all these pieces make up our like critical consciousness and how we see the world. And so, and it goes so fast. And that's why people talk about implicit bias, because it's your gut response. So what I was able to do in this work was offer kind of cognitive scaffolds and discourse scaffolds to help shift, interrupt, and offer enough space for a new thought to emerge. And so when we started using discourse protocols across our district, not only with staff, but then also with students. And our city of Tigard and city of Tualatin are partnering up with us so that the city members are also using those discourse protocols. So as a community, we're using similar language to address kind of what Steve had said earlier. People are scared or like nervous about talking about race. So what would that look like if we actually incorporated talking about any topic as part of our muscle memory and our skills development? So, you know, everybody in our system talks about the first thought, second thought protocol, because really time is another mechanism of oppression. So even if you allow a second of pause to think through another possibility of thought, you've allowed the individual to have that imprint. People don't know how to do different if they don't give a way to do different. And so those are the things that I talk about. We have a slew of equity discourse tools that I've developed and supported to really build that. And that comes from critical theory, that understanding that it's kind of like for people to also reflect. You can either, I think, it doesn't really work as well with students to shame, right, and blame, because that kind of impacts their social emotional wellness. So instead, it's the concept of being like inquiry, and so to be able to pose and like hold for a moment their thought and help them unpack it, helps them come to another perspective. So I think those are the things that like we do as a system to kind of help proactively build the capacity for people to have discourses, because you can't, and I've heard at ODE and all these, there's like equity lenses all over the place, right? There's an equity, we do this with an equity lens, we do this with that. And then so my question to folks when they say, well, we have an equity lens, I'm seeking for the personal and professional connection back to, I think, all of our humanity and the ability for everybody to experience the dignity of being human with all the intersections of their identity. And I think to be able to do that, you also have to, let people feel what that looks like when you can be whole in a community. And I think that requires a lot of calibrating. It requires a lot of relationship building and a lot of messing up. But that's the vulnerability that actually requires for us to make those authentic connections, because people can be performative, right, in their actions and do the same thing, if not worse, when you're not looking. And so I don't know. So that's kind of my perspective on things.
Interesting. So it sounds like, there is a systems level perspective, but organizational structural kind of perspective that we have to keep in mind. We have to also have a legal framework in mind, but also it is important to pay attention to the kind of interpersonal and kind of individual kind of reflective perspectives. There are a variety of different layers that we should sort of constantly keeping in mind and trying to kind of promote the work. Any other questions from the audience?
I have one, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So full disclosure, I also work for the state of Oregon, and I'm in the IT side of things, and we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion quite a bit. But one of the things that we confront quite often is the idea that we just need a system to give us the data and then we can do something. In terms of actually getting actionable data that reflects, at least some subset of realities that are being experienced by folks, what do you all suggest in terms of making sure that our actual data collection and the things that go into those kinds of systems that allow us to see what's happening also have that diversity, equity, and inclusion lens or set of lenses? How do we make sure that the inputs, if you will, are also serving our needs to reflect on others' humanity as well?
Can I say one
Had
thing?
the hand up.
Yeah, I just want to say something because I really wanted to, I thought about this when Steve was talking about audits, and Latricia was talking about audits as well. And I know that there's a conversation about quantitative data. In our school district, we take the ethnographic approach as well to support that quantitative data. So like seeing the problem, I mean, my issue, this is sometimes with quantitative data is like, I have been in education for 2 decades, and the thing that I always see is like, okay, we have the data, but people don't do anything with it, or they don't do anything substantial with it because the data tells you the what, but they don't tell you the why. And so that doesn't get you to the root cause. So when you talk about building a comprehensive data collection process, you really think through how do you get the voices of those that you see are not being served well. And so I just wanted to offer that perspective as well. Like when we were tackling hate speech in our school district, we not only saw the data about impact, but we also hosted listening sessions that were also healing in nature, because oftentimes those that experience hate speech don't actually get their experiences mirrored back to them as as being heard and taken seriously. Oftentimes it's met with like detour conversations. And so I just wanted to offer that perspective as well, because that's what allows the actual shifts in systems is through the whys, so that you can address it and target that. And equity work is all about data and all about those pieces. So I just wanted to piggyback that with Latricia's and Steve's insights around audits.
Well, in the data, just because you collect it doesn't mean it says anything, right? And so your point about, kind of root causes, unless you figure out what you need data to tell you, then you're not, really asking the right questions. So really doing kind of deep root cause analysis is key. I always have the school, you can ask people the question why, and 5 times. By the time you get to the 5th time, they've kind of gotten down far enough to it and they can actually identify what the problem is. I think that kind of rigor and that kind of approach to it is kind of what we need. I'm working with Catherine Helms and Terrence a little bit too, in our IT department, trying to really get at that, because my question was, they want to do a performance dashboard. I'm like going, okay, so what do you want to put it on there, and why do you want to put that and not that, right? And so we're asking some of those questions, and Catherine's been really a great partner trying to understand ownership and format and kind of, the bias kind of built into data. And so the state's way behind. Even in technology, we're pretty far behind. Something's always breaking at the state. And so we're trying to it's true. So we're trying to kind of figure out how to manage that with the resources that we have. We were able to get a couple more bodies into her shop, which is great. And I think we're going to do more work around that. But you're absolutely right. And I think kind of, unless you're asking the right questions, the data is meaningless. I mean, it doesn't have a whole lot of meaning around equity. I'll put it that way.
Patricia, do you have anything that you want to add to this point?
Yeah, I think that similar to what Zinnia and Steve said, the data kind of is a double-edged sword, particularly when we're talking about race and ethnicity. My experience just before I left the state OHA was that our community partners had organized and advocated for legislation around more granular race and ethnicity data collection. They called it REAL, race, ethnicity, and language data collection. And then that was partnered with disability. So then it became REAL plus D. And there was a legislation that got passed around how we collect granular race, ethnicity, language, and disability data that was all about sort of how people self-identify and empowering people to self-identify and creating enough granularity so that people could self-identify. The level of granularity, I think, posed some challenges for folks in IT to be able to create systems that work there, or people who are designing forms who want to keep all the information on one page, you know, for what that's worth. Part of my concern about the pushback is, you know, we had just gone through the, what is it, ICD-9 conversion to ICD-10, and like that granularity around like your diabetes and like, you know, it just like it's voluminous, right? Those codes, and we can somehow have systems that can get to that level of granularity, but we want to talk race and ethnicity, they want to keep it to 5 categories, or, you know, zip code, infinite, race, ethnicity, 5. So there's that kind of pushback around that. But for me, I think the crux of that issue, I think to the point around why root cause, bias, all of that thing, is it really doesn't matter how I self-identify on a form. It matters how the person at the front desk sees me. It matters how my doctor sees me. It matters how the police guy who pulls me over sees me. It doesn't matter how I self-identify. And I think we miss that conversation, and we're not quite there. And I'm not really sure who is quite there yet. I haven't really seen a system that can talk about the bias at the front desk or at the provider level, and want to hold on to the importance and the reality that people need to be empowered to self-identify and not be labeled, and then have care that meets their needs, their culture, their values. So there's these two sort of competing identities around data. And I haven't seen people give that conversation the time and the space that it deserves.
Well, and the cop-out is that when we started the conversation earlier this year about let's expand the real D and kind of the disaggregated data across the enterprise, the cop-out was, which is frustrating, is that, well, we'll require everyone to do that if they already collect that kind of data and as technology allows them to do it. Well, that's kind of pushing it off into never land, because the state really as a matter of practice doesn't do a really big investment in technology, so they will never be able to do it, right? And so that's kind of that's the cop out on that one, is that, you know, you do when you see the need, but then they push it so far down the road, you're not going to really get it in time to do anything different.
I also wanted to ask, it was not in the prepared question, but it came to me. When we as a chapter were kind of moving forward with our strategic planning, and I said, you know, we decided that we would put, you know, social justice as one of the main kind of focus that we want to frame our activity around. And when we were actually writing how we want to do this work, we had a huge conversation on whether to sort of capture what we want to do under the larger concept of social justice, or whether to call out the racial inequity and focus on racial inequity part. And we did some research, and we recognized that many organizations are really sort of highlighting the work around racial inequity with the idea that if we tackle racial inequity, we have to tackle the racial inequity because that is at the core. But also there was a conversation among us saying that it feels like if we just highlight racial inequity, it comes across like we are not paying attention to other inequity. And so what are your thoughts about those 2 points?
Tricia, you want to talk about centering on race? You want to take that one up?
Say that again? Can you say that again?
About centering on race and kind of the value of that. You want to take that one on?
Yeah, I can speak briefly about that because Washington County has committed to leading with race, and that's something that we did also at the Oregon Health Authority, and we talked about race and, so that it's not an either or, it's a both and, but we lead with race and then we look at the vulnerabilities that come along with other ways that we institutionalize privilege for some and marginalize others. But also recognize that within the other sort of social justice issues, that those also, there's also inequity within those when you look at race or skin color, really is kind of the way that it plays out. So the language that's been used in Washington County is that jurisdictions that focus on race and racial equity tend to do better economically from a business case, and that when there is a focus on racial justice, everybody benefits. So other marginalized groups benefit as well. So I think that that's the approach that we're taking. I think the other piece is that in a white dominant culture society, white people can identify potentially with, someone in their family who might be LGBTQ or have a disability or be a veteran. And so are more inclined to have that conversation because they can personalize it a little bit easier than if they were asked to talk about race. And we know that in Oregon and in many other places, people are much less likely to engage with people of a different race than theirs. So there tends to be a little bit less of that coming from a place of compassion.
Absolutely.
So focusing on racial justice or racial equity does not exclude people's otherness or any other kind of it doesn't mean that you do any less for anybody else. It also kind of acknowledges people's lived experience. They're different, but at the intersection, if you take any measure indicators that people of color will always do worse regardless of the other identities that they have. And so if you can address things at a racial level, like Tricia said, everybody does better. Everybody does better.
So I absolutely agree. And I think my approach is more aligned with calling out the behavior and the outcome, right? So when people refuse to talk about race, they oftentimes offer counter narratives. So my framework also is through the concept of discourse. There's, discourse zero is the discourse that, is what you can find as detours, as well as explicitly racist comments. Discourse one is kind of what I am talking about around color blindness. So people use this concept of color blindness to either it's the deliberate and conscious refusal to account for race. And so Bonilla Silva, Ulichi and Beatty, and Tatum in the realm of education and social sociology talks about the impacts of colorblindness and how it gets upheld and reinforced through whiteness, individualism, and meritocracy. And the reason why that's so powerful is because after it's the post Jim Crow era and so forth, that's the new racism that we find ourselves in, is the soft hand of bigotry, right? Is the perpetual racial trauma that oftentimes gets imprinted onto our community, really. And so I like to name that and how it shows up in behaviors and discourse so that you can recognize it and be able to, I think, like Steve said earlier, to be able to shine a light on it and reflect it back so that people can see how it shows up in discourse, see how subtle it is, but how reinforcing it is as well. So I think the question that I would offer or ask you is, or as a group here, you know, what is your intention? Because if you are wanting to say, you know, if you are wanting to put out, you know, your commitment to racial justice and social justice, then you have to stand by that. And that means the integrity to do that within your own committee, personal and professional, is tied together when you're talking about equity work. You have to build your own critical consciousness before you can help lead others towards that. So that's my ask for you, is what's your commitment to that? If you're not ready to do that, I wouldn't put, you lose credibility when you say things that you're about to do when you obviously are not ready to do it. And I bring that to my equity teams and stuff like that. So be willing to commit to what you're willing to commit to. If it's aspirational, how are you building your skill set to do that?
I see, that makes sense. But we have 15 more minutes, and so one of the questions that we prepared says, what are the advices you have to other public administrators, particularly the ones who may not be kind of tasked to do a DEI work, but working in the public nonprofit, you know, or public service arena? What kind of advices you have how those people can promote or work in the DEI arena? And I think Gina mentioned one, that, you know, you have to be critically reflective. You have to have a critical, you have to analyze yourself critically and see if you can really commit. I think that's a really good advice. But what other type of advice do you have?
Well, I'll start. So I kind of go to people, not necessarily first, but I think that understanding, kind of mapping who you have to deal with, right? Who's in your organization. And, you know, the question about how much information do they have, or how much apathy exists around them? How engaged are they? How disengaged are they, right? So kind of putting people in that kind of frame is helpful. And then what you want to find, or you want to understand kind of, where's your leadership on all this? You know, where is the leadership and where does the support come from the top, right? And then kind of, where are the decision makers in that, right? Kind of the folks that actually allocate and, you know, kind of make decisions about where an organization goes. Understand kind of where the leadership is, where the decision makers are, who they are, and take the temperature with them. The other categories of people I would look at are what I call context shapers. They're the people that understand this work a little bit and they do some of it, but don't do it across the enterprise or the organization, but they get it, you know, and they try to do it where they can. But they're the folks that are going to help you take whatever your line of business is and apply what really is a real racial equity lens on it, right? And then there's another group of people that I call influencers. They're the people that lead in other areas, but if you're going to do any real organizational change, which is what a racial equity strategy is really about, it's organizational change, change the way people act, think, and do, that you've got to get people that influence others, right? And so where's that cadre of people that can help you spread the word? And then the final group is kind of the frontline folks, you know, so you've got to figure out where your group is and your other employees, your colleagues. And so I think kind of starting from the top down, doing a map of what's out there is one thing. Then you got to do a little bit of a policy analysis. You got to figure out, okay, so what policies are in place to support this work that I want to do, right? And where is my organization in its readiness to talk about what I want them to do? So there's an assessment, there's kind of a mapping and inventory of your policies, and then there's just understanding who you're working with. I think it's really important. So those are the kind of three things I would throw out there.
Thank you. Letitia?
Agree, ditto. And then I would say one is moving away from an either or kind of mindset to a both and mindset. And there's a number of ways that I think about this. One is what I was going to say at the beginning was, approach this from a long game perspective, and create opportunity, create space and opportunity to think about this strategically. But that's an either or mindset, because the other reality is, and I think we learned that this year, is you have to be ready to pivot and react. To the point of your question around George Floyd. And so you can't ignore the crisis because of the focus on the long game. So I think it really has, for me, become more of the both and in this moment, because we don't know what's going to happen next. We didn't know what was going to happen at the beginning of January. And we certainly didn't expect 2020 to turn out the way 2020 did, even though we've been in this long game for a long time. I think this is the hardest job. We used to joke in our office, like, it's not rocket science. This isn't neurosurgery. And yet we have sent people into space and we have done brain surgery. And so I think it might be harder than both, because we haven't, as a country, quite figured out how to advance the needle. The work has been happening for years, and really we haven't made a lot of traction in terms of social change, right? The indicators would suggest that we're losing ground. I do think that self-care is essential in this work. It is deeply personal as well as professional. And so we have to really take care of the people who are doing this work. And I think, to Steve's original point around kind of knowing who supports the work, who doesn't support the work, is you really can't do this work alone. I was in a meeting earlier today talking about the proverb that says, when spider webs unite, you can tie up a lion. And I think that is so essential. This work requires coalition, it requires mentors, it requires allies, it requires leading and learning. So I'm really appreciating the time on this call, because I continue to learn so much from Steve, and I'm learning from Zinnia, and I'm so glad that you work in Washington County, Zinnia. I'll be hitting you up later. But this is the essence of the work, is that you cannot do it alone. So I think that's to me, to protect your heart, your health, your energy, to be able to stay in this a long time. Folks in the civil rights movement, I think, really did give us the pathway, which is collective action, and a multiplicity of strategies, but always collective action.
Yeah.
Yes, I just caught myself yes, 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 and yes. And what's interesting is, I had a colleague that told me, once that, do we really believe that racism is ever going to go away? And one of the things that I had to help remind my staff and my district is that, so there are a couple of things that for us to remember, and I think it's along the line with what you're talking about, Latricia, is that it takes all of us all the time, always, because this is going to be a perpetual commitment, right, to address and continue that. And so one of the things that I realized was, I took away the stress of having to change somebody's mind right? That is like, that's not my job. My job is to give enough space for you to see that there's another reality out there. And that you can, as we build more imprints for that to happen, I'm not in a fight with you. I'm not in a whatever with you. All I'm doing is offering that your absolute is not so absolute. And the other part of that too is when you talk about systems. I'm a big believer of systems thinking as well. And there's this concept for me. It reminds me of the story that you brought up, Steve. And in my system, what I try to remind people that is that a disconnected system is a system that breeds inequities and reinforces it. So it's our charge as leaders, as community members, to connect the dots, and so that we as a system talk to each other, so that we're not always starting over, or we're not always, we have amazing foundation to grow from. And I think that's kind of what Latricia been bringing up, right? And it is a powerful thing to know that you're a part of a bigger picture. And the ongoing quest to continue that. Hopefully we will get to some point where we can get some things figured out, so that we can have our future students, families, be able to take that work on, because it's going to be necessary. It's never going to be complete. So the minute that I released myself from saying, I'm going to fix this, which is also a huge hubris, right? That's not the way to be. Is that's when you start embracing that process, and that membership of something that not a lot of people stick with. So I hope that gives some solace, and know that you're not alone. And there's a lot of people that are cheering you on, because we can't do it alone.
Say one more thing. Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to take off my systems hat for a minute. That's an ideal world, right? That's not the world. The reason why this work is so hard and so exhausting is because it's messy, right? So the idea of having a system out there is great, but I kind of think of myself as kind of a policy entrepreneur, right? You got to go where there's energy to get something done, right? And so, don't wait until the system's kind of perfectly lined up. You say, if you see some people that are interested in moving the needle in a particular way, go to them, support that, right? It's kind of keep in mind in terms of system, be clear about where you want to land, kind of what's the end point, but be real flexible about how you get there, right? So be clear about your end point, but flexible about the means. I call that firm flexibility, right? But it really does help, kind of create a system framework, but you just go where the energy is. That's the best way I can say it.
Thank you. That's very encouraging, a really good perspective to have. So I just want to be mindful of everybody's time and make sure that we wrap up at 7. So once again, thank you so much for participating on this panel discussion. I personally enjoyed so much, and I feel like I learned so much only just within this short time frame. And I hope more people would have I wish more people were here to hear from you, but we recorded the panel, and there are some people who told us beforehand that they would like to come back or not. So with your permission, we would like to share the discussion with other members if we get the request. Also, I wrote in my email that as a token of our appreciation, we would like to sign you up for the ASPA membership for a year if you are not the member. And not that it will come with a lot of benefits, but it will give you access to the journal, some newsletters, some email, and also there will be a virtual conference coming up. And so you still have to pay the conference registration fee, but you can get the membership kind of rate. So I'm in the process of figuring out how exactly I do that. We got a permission from the ASPA National that we can do that. So soon, I hope that notification for your ASPA membership will come. I also, my apologies upfront for kind of having the communication being a little bit mixed up and the logistics on having the annual meeting and the panel was not very clear. We're just talking that we learned the lesson. So next time we'll do a little better job in organizing the event. And then also this is just the information that I'm also an associate director for the Center for Public Service, which is one of the centers within our Hatfield School of Government. And I'm working with Jamel Bell. This is his idea. He came to us and said, I think we need to have some kind of a non-degree professional development certificate for people who want to engage in this DEI work. And so I'm so grateful that Jamel came to us. We are going to work on it. And so as a way to do it, what we are thinking is, bring people like you who are already doing the DEI work and kind of have some brainstorming on what kinds of things it should be, the certificate curriculum should include, and kind of have a discussion. And then based on that, we can kind of try to put together the curriculum. And maybe we might ask, all of you to come in as a, lecturer, instructor, or something like that. It's still up, up in the air, and we haven't kind of formulated the specifics. But just wanted to share that that's in the works, and we will probably come into you for an advice. Also, in the process, we're thinking, this time we did a panel discussion, but maybe we can kind of ask each one of the people who are doing the DEI work to kind of do a speaker series. So more people can hear from more people who are doing the DEI work. So this is a little aspirational, but I know Jamel has a lot of energy. And so hopefully when you get the invitation, please come and help us develop the certificate. All right. So with that, thank you. All right. So with that, I think it is just 7 o'clock. Thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Take care.